So Sean, really, it's great to see you again. I don't think we've really had a chance to talk in depth since I did an interview with you around your book, which I very much enjoyed, Warrior Compassion, Unleashing the Healing Power of Men.
Mm,
So today I want to kind of talk a bit about your journey, where you came from. I took
mhm,
some notes to ask you. You describe yourself, you call it a men's management strategist. Love that. Disrupting the quiet crisis in warrior culture. So, what do you mean by that exactly? Let's
yeah,
get in and unpack that and tell us a bit about your journey and how you address these issues in your world.
mhm. No, totally. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I call myself a men's engagement strategist first and foremost. Um, I've been around men's work for probably nearly a decade at this point, and have been an organization development practitioner for over 25 years, developing change agents, and I think this is where my worlds combine in terms of how to help organizations think about how they're engaging men in new ways. And so, where there may be resistance, where there may be um, uh, counter initiatives against DEI, where there may be um, um, just cultural blockages, or where men are just suffering in silence in organizations and not engaging. It's that the whole premise is how to help organizations think about men in their organizations differently. And then the quiet crisis in warrior cultures. When I graduated seminary 2 days after saying my vows, um, I had gone from Wall Street to Eileen Fisher Women's Fashion Company, went to seminary, became an interfaith minister. And 2 days after saying my vows, the call to work with cops and police really opened up. And I got a, a video from the chief of police of the Asheville Police Department. I was moving from Spanish Harlem, New York to West Asheville, North Carolina in a couple weeks. And this is really asking in this video, um, we're reforming the department if anybody in the community wants to be part of police reform efforts. And I responded and somehow ended up having a one-on-one with the chief of police. And his ask in my conversation with him is, can I help him deepen the level of compassion among his officers? And can I help to create conversations between officers and community members that humanize each other for a new relationship going forward? I said yes. They lost probably 80 officers to retirements and resignations back in 2020. So they didn't have the bandwidth, but a group of us, mostly FBI, former FBI, came together and formed a new initiative called a national initiative called Project Compassion, to deepen compassion in police departments. And that's really the idea behind Warrior Compassion, the book I wrote. And then at the same time, I find that I just have I'm working more with law enforcement, first responders, military vets, and so those men that work in warrior cultures. And we look at the statistics of any of those arenas, the numbers. There's the high numbers for men around some of the challenges facing men, and then those numbers just skyrocket for men in these professions. And so, how do we address the quiet crisis of the suffering of these men? And that's really the premise of the work.
That's a lot, and it raises a couple of questions for me just off the top
Yeah.
to go a little deeper with this. So, one question is, what do you mean by warrior cultures? You've given examples about police and military, and not everybody puts those together and puts the term warrior cultures with that. So maybe you could say a bit about the term itself, how it applies to this kind of fairly broad range of professionals who, work in protecting and what links all these people together for you?
Yeah. Well, I think what you just said, I think first and foremost is the mission. The mission, these are mission-driven roles. You don't fall into them by accident. And it's typically to protect, to defend, to serve, um, to help. I mean, there is a service component to it. And it really is that, I think, defender energy that plays out as protector, as defender. Um, and there's also something I think that happens in the academy and the boot camp that, when you are brought into these systems to do the work effectively, there's also, I think, in some ways, a bit of dehumanization that happens. Like you kind of lose yourself to be able to serve or to be able to go into fires, to make arrests, to kill. That there has to be there's something that happens in the process. And I just see these cultures of militarized to paramilitary environments um, that brings folks together. And sometimes I think it's, one, the question I have is who's drawn to these fields and what are they bringing with them in terms of some of their conditioning, some of their ideas of manhood and masculinity, what happens in the culture, what happens at basic training or in the academy, and then what happens on the job and what happens in the culture. And then also when we look at, even the the aspects of maybe even some more extreme behaviors, what's playing out in these systems. And so that's how I kind of connect the dots. And when we look at the warrior archetype, it is that fierce defender, that fierce protector. And it's also when we combine it with, strength, courage, and compassion, what then becomes possible in terms of, the healing for these folks, and then also what happens in the communities that they reach and touch.
I think powerful, important, and articulate. So thank you for that. The other word I feel like I need to ask and to have you speak a little more is the word compassion.
Mhm.
Because in some way, the ideal of protecting and serving and being there is, shows compassion for the people you're serving. But often, at least within some groups, we don't see the military, for instance, or police, for instance, as having a role of compassion for others. It's more like hurting, killing, destroying. There is that identity that many associate with soldiering and military people that I think is not accurate. But there is both a compassion that they do, and I think what you're saying is we need to have compassion for these men mostly, although there are obviously women in those fields as well. So speak a little more about the compassion aspect of the work that you do and the work that the men that you serve do and women.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, in my book, one of the things that I do is I talk about compassion is defined by about 7 to 9 different faith traditions. What is kind of the universal truth around compassion? And it really is, I think, an action oriented. It's part of pretty much every major faith tradition. So it's steeped in it has historical roots. And I think it's the ability to when we are hardened by what we do, it's asking us to come back into and connect with our hearts. So that when you can still be effective at the job, but you can still have compassion for those who um, you know, both those who may be the adversary, those who that you may be um getting the perp, those who like you can still hold compassion, you can still hold a curiosity for those individuals. But I think more importantly is while we often talk about compassion out there, it's also the compassion we can have for ourselves. Because when we look at the suicide rates, when we look at the addiction rates, when we look at the domestic violence rates of men in these professions, those numbers get higher. And so, what is it, when you are asked to suppress your emotions, you see trauma day in and day out, but you're not able to really process it or digest it. You just keep moving forward. It's going to come out somewhere. And so, I think the more we can do self-care and the more we can have self-compassion, the more they can find constructive and productive ways for these men in particular to be able to release some of that, to process some of that, and to be able to keep moving through so they're not getting stuck down. And then also, you compound that with, say, unresolved grievance, and that can just start to become more of an avalanche, these combination of factors. So I think self-compassion is key, that those acts of self-love, those acts of self-care. And the more that we have compassion for ourselves, the more we can have expansion to compassion for others. So if even if an officer has to arrest someone, they can still have compassion to see the humanity in that person. And maybe they may treat that person differently in the process, you know? Um, so that's kind of that's what I how I think about compassion.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for that. So it- kind of let's kind of broaden out the lens, if you will,
Yeah.
and talk about the institute, the Warrior Compassion Institute, and what that is, and what makes that organization that you've developed and the work that you do different from other, there's a lot. When I started out in the field, as you know, like 50, 60 years ago, there were very few organizations that really focused on men and men's health and men compassion. Now there are many. What do you do, and how's that maybe different or a little unique as I experience it from what other things are going on in the world in that field?
Yeah. So I think Warrior Compassion Institute, first and foremost, we are um, embedding men's healing and transformation work in organizational settings. And we're focusing on, like, as I said, warrior culture, high performance culture. So, public safety and enforcement is one category, national security and defense is another, corporate systems, high performing corporate systems, consulting, law, um, and then essential infrastructure. So, construction, aviation, transportation, that sort of thing. And being able to come into those organizations and help leaders both understand the needs of men in the organization, where we are at this zeitgeist in terms of the state of men, where organizations might go with DEI practices and initiatives that start to include men in different ways. And then also just by engaging men differently, how you're able to support culture transformation initiatives, redefine leadership models, and really help elevate the organization. And so that's one piece. A second piece, we help men's work leaders who want to move from individual transformation and group work to systems level work. And then we also work with faith-based organizations around men's engagement as we see a lot of churches and synagogues losing men. How do you re-engage men in sort of more of a church without walls? And then out in the general sphere, I have a program called Warrior at the Crossroads, and how do we support um, men and warrior cultures who are at the crossroads um, of pivotal transitions and really going on an existential inquiry. And so that's really the gist of what Warrior Compassion Institute is. And we also want to start finding research partners to start looking and studying men and the state of men in these types of cultures because it's not the place that a lot of research is done. And then also our ability to work with men who hold more conservative values and beliefs, being able to really understand their perspectives on manhood, masculinity, and what men need in this day and age.
That's so important and unique. I mean, in my experience working with a lot of organizations over a lot of years in this field, I think what you do is quite unique and very valuable. And I really feel heartened that it's expanding in the world and what you're doing. So I need to ask you this question, and you may have been asked this multiple times before, but clearly the view we've had of warrior cultures throughout at least my lifetime and maybe long before that, warrior cultures uh, have been mostly focused on men. You know, we think of the warriors, and for a long time it was the soldiers. Women, didn't go into battle, at least in our modern. Took some time before women were even allowed to fight on the front lines and so on. So you're talking about men, and I think it's really important to recognize that there are differences in many ways between men and women in these kinds of organizations. And I know you've had experience both in the a women-oriented organization that you mentioned early on, and then the more traditional male organization. So I've a couple of related questions to this. So from both your personal experience and what you've seen professionally as you've worked, for instance, with police, let's give an example of police who, have been traditionally male, but now have female officers. And how do you understand both some of the unique differences that need to be addressed between the male culture and the men that are in the organizations and women, and how do you navigate, you know, these times of confusion and conflict, just even talking about, gender issues or difference
Right.
between males and females and who should get attention and so on. Speak about that issue, if you will.
That's a big topic.
That is.
Yeah. So I
Yeah,
mean,
we got lots of things to cover,
yeah,
but
yeah.
that feels like one that at least I needed to ask you about.
In the beginning when I first started men's work, um, my first thought when people say, "Well, this is for all people," then why not? Why just men? Right? And I said, well, one, there's already a lot of programs like this around healing, well-being, transformation for women. There's fewer opportunities for men, either based on stigma, based on access availability, or men not even knowing this is available, or would they even invest in it? And also when we create mixed gendered environments, it usually creates a different audience than if we create an audience just for men. The second point I'd often say is you don't need another white guy telling women how to do their personal transformation work. And I know a lot of women who are doing this work and leading women work with women in powerful ways that I would never be able to understand. And so I made a clear line that yes, there can be spaces for mixed gendered environments, but there also needs to be space specifically for men because it's what they will often say in the company of men around issues that men never talk about can be really powerful and really healing for the men who attend those groups. The second thing, so I look at there's engaging men, but there's also humanizing systems. And I think one, when we engage men, that's one piece of the puzzle to be able to bring men along so they're not left behind. And also so that when we come into conversations that are focused on gender bridge building, that men and women are equipped to come into the conversation together and hold it from a place that's empowering, not victimizing or not blaming, not shaming or full of anger. And last, I think the work to humanize systems is for everyone. And so I think it's kind of scale, but I think the first thing we have to do is just acknowledge that men do need attention. I think in the past several years, the attention has gone to women in marginalized communities, and men have often either been at the point of blame, shame, or just on the outside and outskirts. And so how can we bring them in a way that makes sense so that they're coming along with everyone else and are part of the solution, and not feeling like they're left out on the side?
It's great. I'm glad to hear your understanding of that, and it leads me to another question about how your work is being received? Because what you're describing it clearly is not a simple or easy way to navigate. I've worked in the field long enough to know you have some significant obstacles. So what I would ask is how are the leaders, number one, within in a sense, the warrior culture and the male leaders, the
Right.
guys that are in charge of the different systems that you work in, how are they receiving your work? Because you're an unusual guy. You're talking about issues that are generally not talked about. So how are the men receiving you? How are the leading men? And I'd also be interested in how the women, either within the organizations or
Right.
other organizations that are women oriented and hear you coming in and want to put more attention on men, how you're dealing with that issue.
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's a how I'm dealing with these issues because I think I just do.
Yeah, well, share a little
So,
bit about
yeah,
what you're hearing, what you're facing,
yeah.
how you dealt with some of the challenges.
Well, I think so. I'll start with coming into organizations. I think organizations are now ready for these conversations. I think post-election, a lot of people are scratching their heads going, what just happened? And how did so many men vote in the way they did? And I think there's also now that DEI is banned in so many ways, there's this needing to get creative. And I think there's just a lot of um, confusion right now in the market. And so I think it's an opening for us to talk about men in a different way. Because it's sort of things have kind of just shifted and unraveled in a way that I'm finding a different receptivity to the conversation. And maybe if not now, um, that it's still on the radar for organizations and they're interested in how do they engage men differently. From a men's perspective, I just find when I lead these conversations, there's just gratitude. There's gratitude to even be able to hold space. But I think the difference is I don't hold an agenda. I don't hold an agenda. I don't hold a feminist agenda. I don't hold a DEI agenda. I don't hold an equity agenda. All my agenda is I care about these men and I want them to be their best. And I want them to be able to heal the wounds that are holding them back. And I think that's a different orientation than some sort of ulterior motive of, okay, but this is in service of something bigger, as opposed to this is in service of men themselves. And so I find that I receive a lot of gratitude. I think when we have some of the harder conversations, it's held with care and compassion and safety. The men are brave enough. And I've found that in every conversation I have, men start to go deep and engage deeply within 15 minutes of any conversation I lead. So I don't really have guys just on the sidelines. I think guys just start to come in and there's a safety and there's a space that they feel like they can really just talk about and they test it out. They test out, is this safe enough for me to have something controversial? And when they don't get the pushback, they're able to just ask the questions they've never asked. They're afraid of being called out or canceled and they're not. And they're just able to be and their questions, their concerns, their points of view are valued and validated. Don't have to agree, but it's like this is your truth and we're going to acknowledge that for you. There's something that just happens. And then for women, I think one, I came from Eileen Fisher, so I think that opens the door. A lot of women can relate to that organization. And so there's something about when I'm bringing the Eileen Fisher way into what I do, but in a masculine form. There's something that I think starts to disrupt maybe some of the walls.
Yeah. Say a little more about Eileen Fisher. You mentioned that. I'm not sure
Yeah.
people, know even what that is. So talk about Eileen
So,
Fisher a little bit and the work you did there and who
right,
they are and why that perspective has been helpful as you've continued your work.
right. So I was a Wall Street guy, consulting on Wall Street, college professor. Left all that at 40, went to work for Eileen Fisher, the women's fashion company. So it's a very cutting edge, conscious fashion company, leading efforts on sustainability, on personal transformation. I started out as the internal change agent for creative and became the head of personal transformation and well-being for the company and seeing how employees were being transformed at a systems level through shadow work, limiting beliefs work, ego relaxation work. And in particular, I was noticing how men were being transformed. An environment that was 83% women, men were being transformed. And, their wives would say, my wife's, these guys would say, my wife said I'm more patient. I listen differently. I stopped needing to be right all the time. I started to be more curious, started to have more emotional freedom in my expression. I started to tap into my creativity differently. I was solving problems differently. But every guy said they were more comfortable in their own skin. And so we got to bottle this up and take it out into the world, right? Like what's happening here? And so that's really been the basis of my work with men is really kind of bringing that perspective. And so I think when women hear that, that like reduces the notch. It's like it's not this men's power sort of thing. It's like really about healing and transformation. And then I often get creative and I'm like, well, there's conversations we can have to really showcase why men need this and why men need their own spaces. And by doing this, it's going to help your organization on X, Y, and Z level, in terms of productivity, creativity, teamwork, cohesion, decision-making, productivity, what have you. Reduced healthcare costs, reduce mental health care, mental health issues and challenges on the workplace, reduce risk for violence. All these things start to play out when we engage men differently. And I think at this point, men are pretty sophisticated when they feel like you're coming at them with an agenda because you want to fix them. And so when you don't hold that and you're really holding that from an open-hearted space of, I just want to create a space for men to be able to talk about what they need to talk about so they can be in a better place. Men feel that they receive it and they're open to it. And I think based on just who I am, how I talk about this, that women have come along as well and are supportive of the work.
That leads in another question I have. You often talk about the hype effect, HIPE effect. Can you unpack that a little bit and talk about how that ties in with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think we're seeing, somehow along the journey, I started, working with police, military. I started working and meeting more white nationalist extremists, hate group extremists. And I dated someone, and my ex-boyfriend was on the path to radicalization. And I just started to intuitively, instinctively know how to work with these guys. And so the hype effect, I call that hate, isolation, polarization, and extremism. So I call it the hype effect on men and culture. And so what is it? What are the psychological drivers of hate? And what's really driving so many men on the left or the right to hold these extremist views, buy into hate ideology, and how do we support organizations and leaders on identifying men who are disengaged? What are some of the signs? What's some of the coded language? And how do we re-engage these guys? Or just help them both be seen, be validated, and at the same time help them see a reflection of their own humanity and kind of say there's alternatives to some of this. And some of it's, coming from unhealed trauma, unhealed wounding, unresolved grievance. And it's just like if it continues to fester and in light of our isolation, loneliness epidemic, plus social media algorithms that are just kind of feeding narratives that support the anger around that grievance, getting to what's underneath the anger, the rage, the hate, and often it's deep-seated fear, unresolved grievances, and feeling like they don't matter.
That is so important and so well spoken. I just to underline it, I'd like you to again say what hype stands for, just the words. And then what comes up for me is how much this is part of or an infected part of our whole culture, not just the warrior,
Right.
cultures and the extremists and the police and the people that work in the field, but So say what the words are and then maybe speak to what you kind of said a number of things that may be underlying causes. And I'd like you maybe to go into a little more detail about what do you think's driving this? Because I see it and I think you do. There's been research that validates this, that this is not just in the United States, that this
Right.
is a happening in many parts of the world, and it seems to be affecting multiple cultures, multiple countries, and yet you have some sense of what what's going on in a deeper way than I think is being expressed and articulated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one so hype, hate, isolation, polarization, and extremism. Um, I would say what's at the root of some of this. Um, I think as I said earlier, isolation and um the loneliness are men shouldering um I think men shouldering it alone combined with not really talking about these issues, not really talking about their grievances, and it just like builds, it festers. I think matterism, do I matter? And more men, being lonely, not thinking like they matter, especially as they get older. But also a lot of our young men are experiencing this, confusing messages around what it means to be a man today. Especially for young men, I think um, a lot of our young men who are now teenagers or early 20s got the message early on that there's something wrong with men, that men are broken, it's bad to be a white man. And so I think there's an aspect of this of, well, where do I fit? You know? And it's a whole community, in some of these with extreme views that are saying you're welcome over here and you can bring all your grievances. And so I think that's part of it. That's kind of playing out. And, we're, I think one of the things that, the left hasn't done really well is engaging men and engaging white men. Um, and it becomes very easy. I've seen sort of like when we look at extremism as a horseshoe, and a lot of men who have gone from the far left to the far right, depending on what grievance may have taken them over. And as I talk to men, it's like, okay, what was that? What was that precipitating event, or what was the thing that took you over to the other side? And I think there's any number of things over the last 8 to 10 years that could have been a factor in the mix. And so I become less concerned about what is the view they hold and more about how they're holding the view from an more black or white extremist view that is very easy and also very hard to dissuade or immovable. And that becomes, I think, the place of saying, okay, so what let's like start to open up from a place of complexity, and like there's a lot more playing out. And I think in the work I do with a lot of these guys, it's seeing each person as a complex puzzle, and each conversation is a com as the complexity of each man. And in that, being able to validate, all the things they love, the ways they are loving human beings, and yet at the same time, they be holding some views that are very toxic or, um, you know, um, harmful. And not to judge those views, but to get really curious about, so where do they come from? What's that about? You know?
Yeah.
So,
What you're saying and what's going on in the culture in the world. I would personally, I'll just speak personally for a moment. Yeah, I was lucky. I met a guy like you when 46 years ago, when I was younger than I am. I'm in my 80s now. So, I was kind of midlife even back then and lost and been through a divorce and was angry and hurt and confused and all of those things. And I could have easily, looking back, gotten into some kind of radical, angry, protest. I want to get them who the them were. Sometimes it was my ex-wife that did me wrong, or the women's movement that didn't understand where
Right.
guys like me were trying and were getting demonized for who we were and so on. But I was lucky. I found a guy like you and got in a men's group that gave me a safe place to be able to just be listened to. When you talk about just when you give guys a safe place to open up without an agenda, we're hungry for that. And I've been in a men's group that's been meeting for 46 years. Number of, actually, three of the seven guys have died. And we're that old, but I'd be curious to just, get a sense of what you've seen when you go into environments that in a sense already are, with guys that have been taught to be tough and to keep our feelings locked inside and to, you know, have an armoring because, at least I was brought up, if you let your feelings out, you're going to be hurt in some way. You will be either taken advantage of, or some guy will steal your girl, or in some way we had to be tough in order to project. And yet you clearly, just in talking to you, I can almost remember 46 years ago when I met a guy like you who just seemed to be a guy that could be present, was
Right.
open, had obviously a sense of solidity about his own life, and worked through a lot of shit himself, and was pretty
Right.
comfortable in his own skin, and then really only wanted me to be open to who I was. And
Right.
how have you done that, in the places you've worked, and what have you brought from your own life that has enabled this to be basically to work? Because what I see you doing is really effective. It really isn't just talk. You've been doing
Right.
it long enough, and you've been in hard environments, and it's actually bringing about results.
Yeah, I think first it's not to have any expectations of change. When people ask me what's the transformation that's created, I said, you're asking the wrong question. I said, this is not a learning and development outcome focused approach. This is personal transformation, and we're planting seeds for each other. We're reflecting each other's humanity back to each other, and trusting that, as I share my insights and my energy with someone, that they're gonna be building those experiences with different people, and it's gonna germinate in their time. So one, I let go of expectations that this has to be anything other than what it is. That's first. Second, I mean, I also acknowledge my package privilege. I'm able to go in and look the part. So I have credibility with these guys from a looks, energy standpoint. I think that's important. But then it's I find that because I've worked through a lot, I don't have a victimization about the suffering of men. I'm very matter of fact about the suffering of men. I think when we are in the victimization of it, we sensationalize it versus no, this is just what men go through, right? And then when men realize you just are like naming off the ways men suffer in silence. I do it in my book, I do it in conversations. I just start seeing the nods. And
Yeah.
men are like, yeah, I get it. Yeah, that's me. You know, how'd you know my story? I'm like, because you're a guy, you're a dude. This is what we go through. We just don't talk about it. And I think when men are courageous enough to then acknowledge the ways, they suffer and they model that, then it gives other men permission to talk about it. And we start breaking down terminal uniqueness, that I'm the only one that's holding on to this and that other guys are dealing with this too. I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. I think that's one of the most powerful aspects. And so I think a lot of it's framing. How do we walk into the room? And to your point, do we have the confidence that I'm not here trying to save you? I'm not here because I'm coming from the mountain and I have the answer. I'm not a savior. I'm a guy who's been through hell and back, and I can recognize the hell that other guys are in. and that you don't have to. There's ways out, and holding it from that without victimizing or emasculating men in the process. I did a demonstration of a men's circle at a college in Virginia. And at the end of it, and this was like an organization development class with a coaching component. And one of the guys commented at the end, he said, "Wow, you acted like a man treating us like men. That doesn't happen in our field. We have to embrace the feminine and take a feminized masculine in the work to do this work. And you didn't do that with us. You just act like a man and you treat us like men." And it was refreshing. And I think that's the other part of it. We don't have to over process. We don't have to get so deep into the emotions. We can just, I mean, I think the biggest thing we have to do more than anything is just break the wall of isolation for these guys and then trust that the magic happens when men start talking to each other. And then we have enough expertise and knowledge to guide the questions or guide the inquiry so that men can go deeper than maybe they would by themselves. And then we're also modeling the vulnerability and the transparency of our own journeys. I think sometimes we want to over package, over process, over complicate this, and it's often pretty simple. It's just creating the container, creating the energy, and creating the opportunity for men to engage in a different way.
Yeah, it's real simple and also very complex and very uh
Well,
what I get from just hanging out with you and talking with you is that one, you're very real. I feel very comfortable with you even over the years, getting to know you more. But I can certainly feel it as somebody who is seeing you for the first time. You just exude a clarity and a comfort of who you are. And just an intuitive sense, this guy's been through it. He's not talking just from his professor role or what he read in books or what he got, but he's lived it. And there's also for me just a comfort in a physical comfort, a bodily comfort, a sense of presence that I feel. And I know you talk about something that you call the sacred compass.
mm,
And I'm not sure how this ties in with what you just said, but it seems to me that it speaks just the word itself, and you can say what it is for you. But seems to me we need a a guidance system in ourselves to connect with the guidance system in other men so that we can align ourselves to true north, a
right.
direction that allows us to not only stay connected to ourselves, but connects with the other guys and then connects with the rest of the world. It doesn't
Yeah.
separate us, it connects us. So this sacred compass, talk about that.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book is, it's kind of four aspects that prepare us for the journey of our own self-discovery. First, finding safety in the company of men, and what I say is to ugly cry in front of each other and it'd be okay. That level of safety, that level of trust, that level of safety. Second is to see the world with childlike wonder and reclaim play so we can let go of the stoic masks that hold us back. But the third is to surrender into the unknown. And I often use the metaphor of whitewater rafting. We're never in control of the water is in control of us. How do we collide with it? And then the fourth, and I think most importantly, gets to the sacred compass, learning to listen to the voice within, right? And so we talk a lot about active listening, but do we talk about deep listening and the listening within and trusting our intuition, or for a lot of guys, trusting our gut, but really understanding what that is, and that when we're in alignment with ourselves, that there's a knowledge, there's a wisdom within us that can guide us, especially in these times of uncertainty. And so that is often what I mean by when we can listen to that inner knowing and really following our sacred compass. When I worked at Eileen Fisher, I wrote an article, I co-authored an article called Nurturing the Soul of the Company at Eileen Fisher. And we asked employees, like, what's the soul of this company? And they said, well, Eileen, of course. But what stood out to me was She trusts the deep intuitive knowing more than empirically based data and built a company from $350 to 450 million annually based on that deep intuitive knowing, following her sacred compass, right? And so this is something that probably is more accessible to women than men. And so it's also training and helping men be able to listen to themselves in a different way. Quiet the noise, quiet the overthinking, quiet the whatever ADHD we're all operating with, or the trauma responses we're all operating with, or the fact that we can't sit with ourselves and getting silent, getting still, listening to that voice, trusting that voice, and then being guided by our inner knowing. And that's what I mean by the sacred compass.
It's lovely. And what comes to my mind is it feels like I know this is true for you. It's been true from my life and my experience over the 80 years I've been doing this. Uh, is that I've had specific men in my life that have been there at certain times and offered guidance, teachers, mentors, some unexpected, that I didn't know at the time were mentors. And I've had powerful women. You mentioned Eileen Fisher and the company and the person. And to me, part of the sacred compass for me also is a connection to the males that go back in my lineage, in the male lineage back. In my one of my books, I talked about where maleness and femaleness began in the evolutionary history of the animal kingdom. And what we discovered, it went back a billion years that were male creatures in the sea, and then evolved, and they were male mammals, and then male humans, and female you know peoples. And it seems to me that part of this compass is also tuning in not only to that inner individual, but the lineage of goodness and caring and love and transformation that is part of all our heritage, males and females. And we need to bring out the best in the women in our lives and the men in our lives. And it feels to me like you've been doing that certainly with men, and I'm sure through the men you've worked with, as you pointed out, the women who touch
Right.
them and are part of their lives, it transforms them. So one of the things you I think exude to me, and I want to, as we're getting towards the end of our discussion today, to there in some ways we seem to be in dark times, difficult times, times of trouble.
Right.
And on the other hand, I feel like we're in change times, and at least this is how I hold it for me, that men in some way are both the canaries in the coal mine, indicating the level of dysfunction that we're facing in the world and disconnection. And they're also the hope for the future. There's something about the work that I do and that you do with men that keeps me very hopeful about what lies ahead. And I wonder if you could just talk about your own sense of, the future, what you see in the next year, the next 2, 5, 10, as you look ahead to your own work and the work that needs to be done in the world. How do you feel? Do you feel hopeful? What do you see for yourself and others that you're working with?
When I talk about the work I do with men, I say there's, you know, it's one thing to say I meet men where they are, which I don't. I know I don't use that language because I think that can sometimes feel condescending, like I'm coming from the mountaintop to show you the way. But I do think there's a lot of men who are suffering, and I think some of the more constrictive views we're holding in the world today are leading to suffering, lead to more suffering for ourselves and others. And at the same time, what I often say is I meet men and they're suffering because I've been there. I get it. Um, and and then I listen for their yearning and I offer hope in the midst of both because I think hope is one of the keys. And so when I'm able to see a man, even in his suffering, I can still see his humanity. I see him, I see the love in his heart. And sometimes I see the love and the hate in his heart, right? Or I see the love and the fear, the love and the anger, love and the rain, the love and the rage. And it's like those are parts of him to be understood. And then those can transform when we understand it. But the male ego is if you try to force me to change it, I probably won't, right? But I think that so there's part of it which is listening, like seeing the person for who they are and the truth of who they are. I think another part is that, what is the yearning that maybe they can't articulate, but their soul or their heart is leading them towards, and then offering the hope that the possibilities are available. And so I think what gives me hope in these dark days is when I see men um, for who they are in totality, not just what we want to see as a limited sliver that is of anger, of hate, of rage, or what have you, but the whole person. And then also listen for the yearning of what they're seeking, what they desire. And that they're often sharing their hope with me, right? And there's in the possibility. And so I think that we have a place to offer hope to each other. And that I think when we can see that things are movable, not immovable, that we can be transformed into our best selves, into an energy of love, compassion, deeper humanity. You know, that's where I get hopeful. And
Yeah,
at the same
that's
time, what I'll say is I also see that systems are crumbling around us. Oppressive systems are crumbling around us. I think where we're at right now, that's accelerating. And so it's going to be a bumpy ride for a lot of people. Right. And so it's also how do we hold each other? And something you were saying earlier, it's also seeing the interconnectedness in each other and the responsibility of service to each other. How do we try to hold each other, hang on to each other, hold each other up in these times of upheaval, so that we're able to offer hope to each other. We're able to be with each other's fears, each other's um, deep-seated fears of what's happening and hold it from grounded neutrality, hold it from a groundedness. Um, and I see more and more people stepping into that, and that's what gives me hope.
that's great. Well, me too. And I want to just as we're moving towards closing to have you maybe talk specifically about what's coming up for you. What are the things that you're actually going to be doing or that you are doing,
Yeah.
in the next, year or so? And then how people can be in touch with you as people that will watch this and, read about what I will add to your experience and share in an article, but
Yeah.
how they can connect with you and if they were hanging out with you and going around with you over the next year or so, what would they see you doing? What excites you and what engages you as you're actually doing into the future?
No, terrific. I think the first is my work is falling into probably about four or five different dimensions. And so first and foremost is the work I'm doing in organizations. And I call that strategic men's engagement. And I'm going organization by organization and bringing men's work into those organizations at the systems level. And so that can either look like corporate men's circles. I've been asked to create a men's ERG, um,
What's an ERG?
employee resource group or affinity
Got
group,
it. Huh?
um, or affinity group. Um, and so we're really creating men's programming strategies to engage men differently. The next piece is working with, and I'm starting a new cohort, what I'm calling from circles to systems for men's work leaders who want to start moving from individual and group transformation work to systems level impact work, where they're working in organizational systems and bringing this work in at a higher level. I'm also working with faith communities, so leading spiritual men's retreats, soul adventures, and giving sermons at different churches around men's healing, the ways we heal men and humanize systems. Um, and for my coaching work, I've launched the Warrior at a Crossroads men's coaching. So working with men who are in warrior cultures who are at these transformational pivot moments and want to engage in an existential deep inquiry of themselves. And last time I plan to launch a research study, really starting to look at the state of men in these types of cultures, in these organizations, and say, what is the state of men? How do we engage in bringing leaders together, and men in those organizations together to get their perspectives, attitudes, and engaging with them, as opposed to in some instances that I see, we research about them, we talk about them, but we don't engage with them. And so to really get the real perspective of where men are today, but not looking at them as a scientific research study, but more of how do we really get to see their humanity and what they really see and believe and what they need. And
Super,
you can reach me at warriorcompassion.com. But probably the best way to find me is on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Sean Harvey. Probably the best way to find me. Or you can always find my book on Amazon, Warrior Compassion, Unleashing the Healing Power of Men.
super. Well, I will definitely continue to be in touch with you as we continue to work in the world. I love that you're engaged with individual men, you're working with groups, you're working in institutions, and you understand that, things have to crumble sometimes in order to grow, new things. Death and rebirth is happening in the all aspects of life, and I'm glad to see you're part of the journey together with many other good people. So we will say goodbye for now, and I will hang up the recording for the moment, and then we'll chat a little bit offline here. Hang on.